My sixth grade advanced algebra 1 teacher was a woman by the name of Mrs. Goldsby. Now, Mrs. Goldsby was a formidable presence in the classroom. She was tall and she was large and she was strict and unapologetic for being so. And she was an old school teacher who was determined that if you were going to leave her advanced Algebra 1 class, you had to have a certain skill set. And one of those things was she would call all of us to the board over the course of time, and you had to be able to work problems on the board, but it wasn't about working the problems, it was about being able to explain step by step what you were doing when you were working the problems. And Mrs. Goldsby's advanced Algebra 1 class was one of those gateway classes, like you couldn't go on to any other advanced classes in middle school if you couldn't get through Mrs. Goldsby's algebra class. So that all sounds good, except if you really don't talk. I know y'all can't believe that. But for 3 years of my life, I really didn't talk. I was bullied in middle school, and I responded to being bullied by shutting down. And I didn't talk, really did not talk. And so every time Mrs. Goldsby would call me to the board to work one of these silly little problems, she never let me get far enough in the problem for her to see that I really could work the problems, because when I didn't start talking, when I needed to start talking, she immediately told me to go sit down. And all of those labels that we just too carelessly toss at people, see, I had become every single one of those labels for her. Lazy, unmotivated, not studying hard enough. And then there were probably a few others that she attached to me too, like challenged and slow, and why is this child in this class? What kind of mistake did they make to put her in here? So when the first test came along, because the only thing Mrs. Goldsby had seen of me is the kid who came up to the board and couldn't talk and was immediately sent back to my seat, she had no idea that I really knew how to work all those problems. She had no idea. And so I turned in my first test, and because she had labeled me with all of those names that we just went through, when she graded my paper and got to the end of it and I had a perfect score, she just knew in her head that I had cheated on that test. She just knew it. And so she called me up after class, "Sanders, come up here." What'd I do? And she proceeded to tell me that I had cheated on the test, because certainly poor little me couldn't make 100 on her test. I didn't cheat on the test. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And she hauled me out to my mother's car so she could tell my mother that I had cheated on that test. And then I had to go home and face the wrath of my mother, because my mother was not going to have a cheater in her house. So time passed, and it was time for the second test. And the second test came, and I sat down, and Mrs. Goldsby was watching me like a hawk. See you. Probably 15 minutes into that test, I was done. I think most of my classmates were still on the first page of it. That made me nervous enough that I went back and reworked all the problems a second time. But I was done. So I took the paper and handed it in and went back to my seat so I could start my homework. Mrs. Goldsby was still watching me like a hawk. But when class was over, she called, "Sanders, come up here." Now what? And she's standing there holding my paper with 100 written on the paper because she had graded it while we were sitting there. And she looked at me and she said, "Why didn't you tell me you didn't cheat on the first test?" I did. You didn't believe me. So she apologized, and she walked out to my mother's car so she could apologize to my mother for having called me a cheater because I had not cheated. But then she told my mother that I was going to have detention for the next 2 weeks. Why am I in detention? What I do now, we're going to put you in detention for the next 2 weeks because you need to learn how to explain problems at the board. And by golly, I'm going to make you learn how to explain problems at the board because you need to be able to make an A in this class. If you're going to make 100 on every test, you need to be able to make an A in this class, and you cannot make an A in this class if you cannot explain problems at the board. So for the next 2 weeks, I had detention every single day for an hour. And if she thought that was going to make me talk, if she thought she was going to be able to pry something out of me, not a word. I worked the problems all the way to the end and smiled. And she thought, what am I going to do with you? And I don't know. So about this point, I should say that teachers have always been saints to me. Teachers and college professors have always been numbered among my saints because they have been the folks who have rescued me from myself more times than I can count. And if you're wondering how on earth Mrs. Goldsby could be numbered among my saints after she accused me of cheating on a test and then kept me in detention for 2 weeks, well, there's the rest of that story. I never made an A in Ms. Goldsby's class because I never explained a problem at the board, so I never made an A, despite the fact that I could turn in a paper with 100 on it, and I just was not going to make an A. So I got over that. And then I started wondering if I were ever going to see another advanced class again because Mrs. Goldsby was the one who was holding that key. She had the key, and she could wreck my middle school years if they weren't already wrecked. And Mrs. Goldsby decided that I needed to go on. I needed to go on in those advanced classes, even if I couldn't say a word. I needed to go on. And she opened that door and shoved me through it into the waiting hands of a 7th grade English teacher who, although I never participated in class, looked at what I wrote and thought, well, she really does understand even if she won't talk. And she recommended me for a program that met at the University of South Alabama. I'm from Mobile, my hometown. That met every week at University of South Alabama. I'd never been on a college campus in my life. The instructors in that class looked at me, even though I still wasn't talking, and they said, there's a program at Baylor University in Waco. You need to go to that. You need to go, and you need to do that. All of a sudden, there was a world opened for me that I had no idea about. And it was opened to me because one teacher who had labeled me was willing to take a second look and was willing to see what was beneath that quiet kid who couldn't explain an algebra problem at the board. When we attach labels to people, we miss out on the good, on the beauty, on the image and likeness of God that is who we all are. No doubt, when Jesus was being followed by all kinds of folks from around the Galilee, he realized that there were labeled people among them. There were people who had been labeled as ne'er-do-wells. There were people who had been labeled because they just couldn't work hard enough. There were people who had been labeled because they owed people money. There were people who had been labeled unjustly for all kinds of things. And when we get labeled, we get pushed aside and we are forgotten. And so when Jesus begins to address this crowd in the lesson that we have from Luke today, he knows that somewhere in that crowd is someone who is sick physically or emotionally with no resources to see a doctor. He knows that someone in that crowd is doing back-breaking, spirit-breaking work all day, every day, but can't come up with enough money to pay their debtors. He knows that someone in that crowd has been persecuted and is in fear of his or her life just by coming out to see Jesus. And he wants to give them a stunning message. You are not forgotten. You are blessed. You are loved. You are embraced. You are held. Because just because the Roman Empire has oppressed everyone around, God does not label you in the way that the empire has labeled you. God sees beyond your labels. God sees beyond your limitations. God sees beyond all of the things that would be your barrier and your stumbling block. God sees beyond all that and sees that you are God's beloved. And so there they are, hearing words that they thought they might never hear. We haven't been forgotten. We are loved. I think far too often we think of saints as being these superhuman people. We celebrate the saints throughout the year, and we look at what they've done and we go, oh, I could never do that. I don't have the courage. I don't have the presence. I don't have the words. I don't have anything I need to be one of these saints. But see, that's not true. Saints are not people walking around in capes and tights with big S's on their chests. Those are comic book characters, and that's not real. Saints are people just like all of us, who point us to a different way. They point us to a different way of seeing, and they point us to a different way of being. They stop us in our tracks, and they remind us, don't leave anyone behind. See, notice, pay attention. Take a hand, because that soul that seems to not matter, that soul matters to God. That soul matters to our God. And so if you're thinking today that we all can't walk out of here and be a saint to someone, well, it is completely and totally within the realm of our possibilities for us to walk out of here and be saints. Because all we really have to do to walk out of here and be a saint is to see. We have to see the child of God who has been left behind. We have to see the child of God who has been marginalized. We have to see the child of God who is hungry. We have to see the child of God who is hurting. And if we see anyone who does not realize how beloved they are by our God, we need to do only one thing. And that is let them see Jesus in us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.